Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. This session is a multidisciplinary team approach to victim-centered care. And we have a wonderful speaker here with us today, Kim Nash. And I'm just going to take a moment to introduce Kim. Kim Nash has been a registered nurse for 23 years and a forensic nurse for the last 15 years. She's dual board certified as a SANE A and a SANE P. She's a forensic nurse specialist with the International Association of Forensic Nurses and provides education, training, and technical assistance for healthcare professionals, law enforcement, attorneys, and advocates. Ms. Nash's forensic nursing clinical experience includes 12 years as a forensic nurse examiner at University of Colorado Health in Colorado Springs, Colorado, where she provided medical forensic care to patients who were victims of violence. And that included sexual assault, intimate partner violence, child abuse, elder abuse, strangulation, and human trafficking. She was the Colorado SANE Safe Trainer for 3 years, providing statewide education for healthcare and multidisciplinary partners, conducting clinical skills labs, and participating in statewide protocol development and legislative work. In addition, Kim has worked as a forensic nurse at a child advocacy center for 3 years, and her international experience includes working on projects as a forensic nurse consultant in Swaziland, Egypt, and Mexico. And then just a couple housekeeping items. Thank you so much, Kim, for being here with us today. We're so excited for the information you have to share. Just want to let folks know that I'll be providing tech support. My name's Rachel, and I'll be providing tech support throughout this session. So if you have any issues, you can feel free to message me. You can private message me. This meeting is being recorded, so just want to let you know about that. And you should have heard an announcement about that on your computer. And at the end, I'll be sharing a link to a survey that you can all take before we head out for the day. So I will just go ahead and turn it over to Kim. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Rachel. I always feel so awkward when my bio is being read. I feel like we should just say, we all do the work, we all bring experience to the table, so let's learn from one another, because there isn't ever a situation where I'm presenting something that I don't learn so much that I either use in my own practice or when helping other communities develop their SARTs or programs. So thanks for being here today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I'm sorry about before. It wouldn't let me into the breakout room and they had me log out and log back in. So I'm glad we're all together now, but let me share my screen. Oh, I'm not able to share my screen, Rachel. It says host disabled screen sharing. In the meantime, what I would really appreciate, if you guys don't mind, if you could put in the chat box what your discipline is, or your role, or your job title, just so I have a better understanding for those of us in this breakout room where we're coming from. That would be appreciated. Advocate, great. And Fond du Lac, is that Wisconsin? Minnesota, dang it. I used to live in Minnesota too, so shame on me. Lead advocate at Child Advocacy Center. Let's see. In Oklahoma, good. I just taught with a nurse in Tuba City, Arizona, who is from Oklahoma. SART coordinator in Michigan. Advocates, West Virginia, Mississippi. Alabama, I've done some teaching there too. Michigan, West Virginia. Excellent. Let's see if I can screen share now. I can. All right. Excellent. It is a little bit more difficult for me when I'm screen sharing to see some of the comments. Do you know, Rachel, if there's a way?
Yeah, I'm very happy to monitor those. And my only question were, do you want questions as we go, or would you like questions at the end?
I'd like them as we go, if you
Okay,
don't mind. I'd really rather this was more of a discussion than a lecture.
absolutely.
And out of curiosity, is it possible for people to unmute if they'd rather ask or talk?
Yes, they should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay. All right. Well, don't be shy, please. I would really rather that we hear other voices besides just mine.
And,
So.
and if you are having trouble unmuting yourself, please do feel free to message me and I can make sure that you are unmuted to share whatever you are wanting to share.
All right. So it looks like strong advocacy participants in this breakout room, which is great. I appreciate you all being here. So my last question before I jump into the content is, Rachel, what time do I have until? What time are we aiming to be done?
We are finishing up today at 2 o'clock, I believe.
Okay. And what time is it for you right now?
It is 12:30.
12:30. So
We have an hour and a half.
okay. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being patient. My name is Kim, and as Rachel said, I am a forensic nurse. I've been a nurse for over 23 years. In the last, oh gosh, I'd have to do math, which is not my strong suit. I can calculate a drip rate if you need me to do that. That's about the only math I'm good at. But I've been a forensic nurse for probably around 15 years. And I had the great fortune of working in Colorado Springs, Colorado at a level 1 trauma center, where initially I was in an on-call program, but we moved shortly after that to what we call in-house program, where our forensic nurses are scheduled in shifts 24/7 at the hospital. Really fascinating that we went from, when we were in an on-call program, we saw about 250 sexual assault patients a year. In our town, which at that point was probably around a population of 500,000. And fast forward greater than 10 years later, those forensic nurses are now seeing about 2,500 patients a year because they've expanded their patient population. So they see any victim of violence, not just sexual violence. So now I live in a little tiny mountain town in Colorado called Buena Vista. I get it's supposed to be Buena Vista, but apparently if I call it Buena Vista, I'm not considered a local. So I'm calling it Buena Vista like the other locals here. So a town of about just a little less than 3,000. And I'm taking call again for our local SART team. So today we are not going to be solely talking about forensic nursing. We're talking about multidisciplinary teams with a victim-centered approach. We're going to talk about key stakeholders, some of the real challenges faced by those key stakeholders, with the understanding that I am speaking from the lens of a forensic nurse or a SANE, although working as state coordinator for 3 years, part of my job duties were to help SARTs develop in communities. And then creating and sustaining a multidisciplinary team. Let's talk about disclosures. I have nothing to disclose. There's no financial gain for me in this. I do work for the International Association of Forensic Nurses now. We're an international membership organization for nurses who care for victims of violence or who do death investigations, so all things forensic nursing. I am particularly working under a grant called the FAST grant, which is enabling me to be here today to present this content to you. And this is a really unique grant that I am very proud to be a part of. IAFN provides the technical assistance for this grant. It's funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, and the project aims to provide training and technical assistance to rural, remote, and tribal communities and sites funded under OVW's Forensic, Medical, and Advocacy Services for Tribes, which overall arching goal is to sustain, establish, or expand sexual assault, medical, forensic, and advocacy services to certain sites. We have 6 sites. 2 are in Alaska. We have 1 in Arizona. We have 1 in Oregon. We have 1 in Michigan. And Who am I forgetting? Arizona. Oh, I'm sorry, the Pipeline Project. I just had a meeting with them this morning. South Dakota, they're fantastic. So let's start with the basics. We can't start delving into the deeper, more in-depth content until we're all on the same page. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly so that we can get to the actual discussion and content portion, which I think is way more fun. But our basics. What is a SART or an MDT, multidisciplinary team? And I use the terms interchangeably, although we're starting to see more MDTs for things beyond sexual assault. Very easy transition is to go from SART to also including domestic violence, but we're seeing more human trafficking multidisciplinary teams and child abuse teams as well. So what is a SART to you? I know that you all can define it. It's a multidisciplinary team that partners to provide interagency coordinated responses that make victims' needs a priority, hold offenders accountable, and promote public safety. That is the definition that I pulled from the Office for Violent Victims of Crime and their SART toolkit. So I think we all understand this. Who are the members of the SART? Who are the core members? But really this could look different depending on your community and the patients, the victims, the survivors that you are providing care for. So if you'd humor me and throw into the chat box some of the core members on your team. Those members that you invite, you expect them to be at the table the majority of the time because their input is essential. Prosecutors, county prosecutors, SANE nurses. I'm glad everybody loves their nurses. I love being a nurse. It's the best job in the world. Law enforcement is PO, parole officer. I think probation officer. CPS, yeah, I think sometimes child protection gets left out of the conversation, which is unfortunate because they have a very important job. I actually think that when you have well-trained child protection caseworkers, that it helps build resiliency in the rest of the team. I say that because when you look at some of the reasons that we tend to burn out, by we, I mean anybody who does this type of work, I think initially when you're new to your role, regardless of what that role is, what you're trying to do is manage your role. So you have this very narrow viewpoint. For me, it's nursing. How do I deal with the injuries I'm seeing? Even harder, how do I deal with the histories of violence that my patients are telling me? How do I deal with the fact for an intimate partner violence patient, I'm probably discharging that patient back home to go live with their abuser? How do you manage that? We learn to manage that, but then a couple of years into the role, as your scope is broadening and you're seeing other outcomes, you're seeing what happens outside of your role. Some of the things that tend to burn us out are things that are beyond our control. And often that may be when we think kids are going back to abusers. That bothers you. I don't care what role you're in. So child protection caseworkers who don't have the knowledge that they need, whether it's intimate partner violence dynamics, whether it's strangulation for child victims, whether it's the ways children disclose or don't disclose, when they don't have the knowledge that they need to do their job well, I think that that can tend to burn the rest of the team out. So I'm very glad that some of you are, I think it was Brooke who put in there, and Nelson's talking about child advocacy centers, really important role to not leave out. Police chaplains, sex offender management, and survivors. Thank you, Dilworth. I don't know if anyone else said it prior to you, but yes, survivors' perspective is imperative. I do think that's one of the reasons why advocates are usually the first discipline that we tend to list off when we're talking about who should be our core members, because whether you realize it or not, advocates, the rest of the team look to you to really be the voice of the survivor. Sometimes that's fair and sometimes that's not fair. So including survivors themselves and not just the role of the advocate Not that I'm saying that you're just an advocate, because advocates are a gift to us all and we couldn't do our jobs without them. So thanks. All right, so who are our core members? Typically, advocates, law enforcement officers, forensic medical examiners, which can be physicians or nurses, forensic laboratory personnel, and prosecutors. Now, I will say that you can get expert advice, expert consensus. We can give you tons of PowerPoints on best practice, but at the end of the day, the expert for your community are those of you living in your community. So even if you're on this call and you're relatively new to your position, you are an expert in the community that you're living in. So if we say these are the core members that should be on your MDT, you can take that information and you can use some of it, or you can choose to not use some of it, because you are the one that knows what your community looks like, and the services that you can and can't provide, and what that core makeup should be. So that core group we're talking about, that core group is expected to be at the majority of the meetings or have representation at your meetings. But sometimes you may need to invite other disciplines or other entities to the table, particularly if you're having discussion around policy or guidelines or approaches that may impact different community makeup, people who make up different portions of your community. So talk to me about some other people that you may want, or other disciplines or roles you may want to occasionally invite to your SART meetings to help with some of the decision-making or approaches. Ooh, I like mayors. Dilworth. Yeah, I'm gonna have you I'm gonna put my mute button on and have you teach if you don't mind. Just kidding, I won't do that to you. Yes, faith community leaders, mayors, people in leadership who need to hear what you're doing and why you're doing it. They may be making decisions, especially funding decisions, that drastically impact what you can and can't do with these SARTs. Thank you. We should have closed captioning. There's an issue with it showing up. Thanks for working on it, Rachel. Community clergy, counselors. Think about your community or surrounding communities. What other institutions might there be that impact large populations? Universities. Thanks, Brooke. Yes, so are your college or your educational institutions, whether that's a boarding school or higher education, are they represented? Youth leaders, absolutely. And when we are talking about universities, oftentimes universities are addressing sexual assault that happens on campus, but take a look at their population of students that live on campus versus off campus, and are those services still being utilized for or available for those off-campus kids? That's great. Magdalena says they've had Title IX and on-campus groups at meetings. Teachers, school board members, very excellent contributions. Other ones that I've seen in my new community, we have a very large prison right down the street. So prison officials may need to be invited to the table if we're talking about things that could impact those survivors or victims of sexual violence that's happening within correctional facilities. And a whole host of others. There may be certain ethnic groups in your community that you want represented, housing authorities. Really, the sky is the limit. It just is look out your window, walk down your street, drive to the other side of town, and what's around. What does your community look like compared to who are the people that you tend to serve? If we have a large population of Hmong in our community, but we're not seeing Hmong patients, does that mean that they're not being assaulted? It doesn't. It either means they don't know about services that are available to them, or they are fearful of accessing services that are available to them. For me, I'm not Hmong, so For me to understand that, I'm going to need some assistance. And I may not ever be able to fully understand it, but I'm not going to presume to have the answers when I'm not a part of the community that I'm trying to serve. Judges. Nelson, that's such a big topic. We could do a whole presentation on the need to educate judges. They are one of the most difficult groups to get in to educate. So for any of you on this call, if you ever have the opportunity, somebody asks you to present to judges, please don't turn it down. They have the power to make decisions that could be very dangerous if they're uninformed decisions. Oh, so Magdalena's talking about elders, care of victims who are advanced age. So they haven't had anyone over the age of 60 go through an exam. So they're currently reaching out to older populations and assisted living. I do some teaching for healthcare providers around the fact that elders can be sexually assaulted, which is a really upsetting topic for many people, very similar to children being assaulted by adults. But we know that perpetrators are sexually abusing because of power and control dynamics, which are fed through exerting that control over vulnerable populations. So an elder may be a very vulnerable person who, just like a child, may even try in their own way to disclose and may not be believed. So important that any disclosure or suspicion for sexual violence with an older person is taken seriously. We talk a lot in healthcare about this term called differential diagnosis, and I think that it translates into other professions. So differential diagnosis is this patient in front of us is displaying certain signs and symptoms. You have to know all the potential things it could be, and you rule those things out through history, assessment, interventions like tests until you come to your conclusion. Well, elder abuse should be the same. You have to have abuse as part of your differential diagnosis until you rule it out. And I think that translates to advocacy, law enforcement, as well as prosecutors or attorneys. All right. So some of these other people or entities or populations that you want represented may need to come to all the SART meetings, especially if your overarching goal is one that impacts that particular entity, or they may need to come to some of your SART meetings. And it's okay if you've got prevalent populations that you want represented. It may be more beneficial to only have that representation come to some of your SART meetings. Inclusion is very important. That's not what I'm saying. But sometimes when you need to get down to final decision making, it is more difficult to do that with a larger group of people. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't gather all of the information that you need from a very diverse perspective. So you want as many people as possible educating your decisions. But when you look at successful boards or leadership groups, oftentimes it's a smaller group that's making the decision versus a larger one. Again, a generality. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about this word justice. And I have to tell you, I'm just going to be honest with this. When I was asked to do this presentation, I was a little bit uncomfortable with it. If you asked me to put together something on why it's important to have a medical forensic exam for patients who are outside of the evidence collection window, I'm your girl. If you ask me to do expert testimony, I'm comfortable with that. There's a lot of topics I'm comfortable with, but I wasn't as comfortable talking to SART teams about leadership and victim-centered care because I come from healthcare. So who am I to talk to you if your discipline is advocacy or law enforcement or prosecution? So this particular presentation that I put together is a brand new one. Oftentimes I can pull an older presentation and tweak it and add some new research, but this one is pretty new. And this is a term that is very interesting to me, this term of justice. So when I looked this up last week to put this presentation together, I found some really interesting definitions that were out there. So here are some of them, and I'll tell you, I think that these ones here came straight from Merriam-Webster. So justice can mean a lot of things. Justice here is the maintenance or administration of what is just, especially by the impartial adjustment of conflicting claims or the assignment of merited rewards or punishments. All right, I'll buy that as a definition. A much more concise one, the administration of law. I like that one. The act of being just, impartial, or fair, or the principle or ideal of just dealing or right action. But this next one is the one that I think fits what we do regardless of our discipline, but when we're looking at justice from a criminal justice standpoint in our SART teams. And that is the process or result of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes and criminals. So it's possible you disagree with me and one of those other definitions speaks to you more or your SART more, and that's fine. They all were pulled from the same dictionary.
Kim, can I join in the conversation?
Please, I would like that very much.
Because I'm just working on a webinar right now about restorative justice. My name is Caroline Blackheader. I'm the lead advocate for the Fond du Lac tribe in Minnesota. And I was trying to get some tribal judges and attorneys, to work on a presentation about restorative justice. And the first thing I noticed about those definitions about justice is that there's no mention of it, of the restorative part. Yep. which I feel is, here it says the process of result of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes and criminals. You do not speak about the victim here. You only talk about the criminals. Like, the criminals are going to be punished. Yep. What happens to the victim? And what's the restorative part of the justice here? And I think it's important to think about that when we deal with victims, about what they want, what they would like to see. And maybe, when we rethink this legal system, this police, this everything that we're trying to change right now is restorative justice circles in an Indian country. They work much better than the usual law, rule of law. That's all I wanted to say.
I agree with you. So I'm going to be coming back to you, Marilyn, in just a few minutes to have more in-depth discussion on what you just said. So if you hold tight, I'm going to pull you back in, and I appreciate you coming off mute to share those comments. So hang tight, and we're coming back to that very thing you just talked about. Okay. I missed one slide, so bear with me. When I was looking these definitions up, I found accidentally that justice was the top lookup for Merriam-Webster dictionary in 2018. It was actually consulted 74% more times than in 2017. So I had to look into this word of the year more. So I found out that the annual word of the year is determined by what word dictionary users have been searching and comparing the frequency with which they were looked up compared to previous years. They surmise, meaning the people who work at Merriam-Webster Dictionary, they surmise that justice was significant in 2018 because it was a term that was at the center of many of our national debates that year. Debates about racial justice, social justice, criminal justice, and economic justice. Particular technical uses of justice were also prominent, as references to the Justice Department were a constant in the news, and confirmations hearings for a new Supreme Court justice had the nation's attention. So then the question of just what exactly we mean when we use the word justice was a part of the discussion. So I apologize about going out of order. This is the definitions of Merriam-Webster, and then this is the one that may probably fit what we do in SARTs the most traditionally. But like Marilyn just pointed out, I think that We are beginning to learn, again, because we used to have a viewpoint that was narrow. We are now broadening our viewpoint, not only in the use of SARTs, because they are much more common in communities, but how are we using SARTs? What are we using them for? What is the purpose of these SARTs? So I would like to do this exercise. You can put it in the chat box, you can come off of mute, but through the lens of an advocate, let's try to define justice in a completely different way than the above definition that we've chosen. I don't have an answer for this. This is a discussion. I would like you to help me come up with some different definitions for justice when you're working as an advocate with victims of sexual violence. And I mean you, I don't mean justice for the survivor. How do you as an advocate define justice in your role? Oh, sorry. And I've been saying Marilyn, it's Carolyn. I apologize. When I'm speaking and sharing my screen, I can't see everybody's picture. So I apologize, Carolyn. Thank you. Anyone want to have there's not a right or a wrong answer. Let's just have a discussion about it.
I really don't. Sorry.
I shouldn't have started with advocates because most of you are advocates.
I don't like typing. It gets annoying.
I agree, please.
But I do feel like with advocacy, it's really important to find out what that word justice specifically means for each survivor or victim that we work with, because one person's justice could just be to be seen, heard, and represented by somebody of statute or by somebody higher that can condone that was an assault. I mean, that alone can be their justice. So just to be seen, heard, and represented, that's what I think in the advocacy world, justice really is.
Love that. That was beautiful, Sarah.
Thanks.
And then we have some comments in the chat too I can read out loud.
Yes.
I know you're navigating multiple things. So Donald, and I apologize if I said that incorrectly, feel free to correct me, but said a balance of right and wrong and knowing the difference. Magdalena said each survivor is fluid depending on experience, on level of offender accountability, on healing process.
I agree with all of that. So what I'm hearing from you right now is your definition of justice may differ depending who you're working with and what their needs are and what their experience has been. And I'm going to go back to Donald as well, a balance of right and wrong and knowing the difference. Just like Sarah said, I think Donald is saying the same thing. Sometimes the clients that you work with, the survivors that you work with they may not recognize that what was done to them was wrong, and you defining for them that was wrong may be important. Is that what you meant, Donald?
Yeah, it's Danelle, but that's
Danelle,
all right.
Thank you, Danelle.
It's a matter of learning what's right and what's wrong, and letting a victim know, a survivor know that they didn't have anything, it wasn't their fault, so it's not wrong. I mean, we have to really establish that. But if you practice that, knowing the difference between right and wrong, then you can sustain a balance, which is important.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I like that, sustaining a balance.
I feel like by doing that, we're allowing our quote unquote clients to feel validated, especially because we all know that the justice system, it's so deeply outlined and specific that we fall through the cracks and we don't get the legal justice that we really crave. So by validating that for our clients and just being able to have that balance like you're talking about, that's a whole nother level of justice that they experience.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And we have a comment from Dilworth who said holding offender accountability with victim input being forefront.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm sure that you have had the opportunity or the experience where you've been working with a client or a survivor and they don't want things to go to court. Have any of you had that experience where we may be working for these court outcomes, yet that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the client or the survivor wants. And conversely, you can have clients where that's absolutely what they want. They want this court of law to define that what was done to them was unjust and illegal and not okay, and how helpless we may feel in our role if our client doesn't get the opportunity for that, whether charges aren't brought forth or, you know, there's a plea bargain that doesn't feel good to us. Sometimes those things are beyond our control. So absolutely, our clients may define justice as a court of law holding the offender accountable, but not all of them. All right, anything else before I move on?
Magdalena had one additional comment that was in the vein of just what you were saying. She said, thanks for bringing that up, Sarah. A lot of my clients don't get the legal system's version of justice. Sometimes an approved order of protection is justice.
Yeah. Yes. And Danelle, that's great. You're not a lawyer, but you would like to speak up. All right. Well, thank you for that. Now I'm going to ask you to do the same thing, but oh man, I'm going too fast. Through the eyes of a medical forensic clinician, whether that's a forensic physician, a forensic nurse, a SANE, sexual assault nurse examiner, whatever your term is for the healthcare clinician who's doing a medical forensic exam. And by this, I mean those who are trained in this work, which is different than your typical emergency room doctor or nurse who's not been trained, and they're opening this kit and they've got this piece of paper in front of them that they're reading and they're following the instructions, and they forget that this is a person with complex psychosocial needs in front of them. I'm talking about the clinician who does get that. How do you think a forensic nurse or a clinician would define justice if they can't use that top definition?
I'm girding at the teeth to answer this one. I get so frustrated finding out how many SANE kits are really just put on a shelf and not processed. And that's really, really devastating. And all that training and all that effort and all that time, that SANE nurse is having a level of almost a relationship with our clients that nobody else will ever have. That's a level of vulnerability that's just thrown on a shelf. So I mean, for our nurses, that's just all that hard work just not recognized or documented. I mean, just to be recognized for that work feels like justice alone.
Yeah. And we don't have any SANEs or forensic nurses in this breakout room. Is that correct? Just me. I am, and I love my work. So I do want to address that, Sarah, and I appreciate that. And I'll tell you that I think that clinicians doing this work have a much easier job than the advocates do. So I think this is beautiful when we're having empathy for each other in our respective roles, just like we can have some of that empathy for the people that we're serving in our roles. I'll tell you, this is something that I really struggled with when I was new. And that's where I come from, like this narrow vision to a broad vision. I struggled to learn initially how to deal with that absorbing of the trauma. And this isn't fair. These people aren't getting their day in court. I'm never getting called to testify. When I do get called, sometimes we get these not guilty verdicts in these cases that really have a lot of evidence, and you're very confused how a not guilty verdict can come about. And it took me about 2 years to learn to manage things in that exam room. And as my scope was expanding and seeing what was happening outside of that exam room, I almost left the work because of this. And I realized that the burnout comes from systems that need to be changed. And when systems need to be changed, I felt like I had no power or control over the systems. And so to survive and not leave the work that I was so passionate about, and on some level in those early years when I was doing this, I actually internally recognized I'm good at this. I'm good at this work. As weird as that sounds, I'm good at it. I realized I had to let go of the responsibility of what happened outside my room. I could only be responsible for that which I had control of. So what do I have control of? I have control over the healthcare I provide my patients. I have control over what comes out of my mouth, so I can learn to use therapeutic communication, and I can learn what is not therapeutic. And I have control over how I educate when I have the opportunity, whether that's educating my patients about health, whether it's educating their friends or family members who are there to support them, whether it's educating the law enforcement officer who's picking up the evidence and saying to me, what do you think? Hey, off the record, did this really happen or did it not? You know, what is my role in effective education in that moment? Or whether it's educating in a pretrial conference with a prosecutor or a defense attorney, or in the courtroom to a judge or a jury. Those are the things that I have control over. We didn't have a SART team when I started, so that was really unfortunate. But then one started to build and grow. And I recognized that with a multidisciplinary team, I did have more control over what happened outside of that exam room. It took a while for that MDT to really grow into its own, but looking back on my own role, it took me a while to grow into my role, just like it probably took you a while to grow into your role. So what are some things that a forensic nurse can do to get justice for his or her patients within that exam room? Any other ideas? I can tell you some of the conversation we've had in classes and in conferences like this. Justice may be the fact that I tell my patient, I believe you. You know, I see everybody around you is not believing you that this happened, but I believe you. Somebody was going to say something, Danelle?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kim. I didn't mean to interrupt you. But when having been a nurse and worked in ERs and other situations, I have a little bit of a background. So when I see a nurse who's not been trained as a SANE, it's one thing that's not taught in the university, in the nursing schools about, well, maybe it is, but empathy and compassion. Look the patient in the eye and don't turn your back on them to fill out your paperwork. That paperwork seems to be so important to everybody, and they got to get it right. But I'm usually invited to a nursing class of juniors here at Marshall University. And I explain to them about being a SANE and how important it is to give the patient, which they're used to saying instead of the victim, you know, time, and say that you believe them, even if you can't make that decision whether you believe or not. I mean, you can't say you're just here taking up my time. That's just not, that's forbidden in my book.
Yep. Yep, I agree. And it is really unfortunate. It shocks people when they learn that these issues aren't taught in traditional nursing school. It's not. And when you just think of the sheer number of interpersonal violence victims that a nurse will come in contact in their lifetime, it's overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And I'm ashamed to admit about, as I became a SANE nurse and then we expanded our practice and I learned about things like the dynamics of intimate partner violence, the dynamics of human trafficking, the dynamics of child maltreatment. I can absolutely rewind in my mind and go back to interactions I've had with patients prior to that education, where I either missed an opportunity to provide interventions or I made things worse for them because I didn't know what was in front of me. And shame on education, shame on us for not demanding that we have that education, but the power that we have, the opportunity for impact is too great to keep ignoring it. So we're making strides, we're getting education out there, but physicians will not tell you much different. When we talk about sexual assault exams or domestic violence, they may say, either I've had no training in it or maybe a couple hours of lecture, which we all know is not enough. Yes, so Dilworth, once again, I'm just going to turn things over to you and you're going to teach, because providing patients with a contact number to an advocate or rape crisis center. First off, I fully believe that the most important intervention that a forensic nurse can do is to connect that patient to advocacy. I can do a lot I can do a lot in my exam, a lot. But my relationship with that patient ends when I discharge them home. The only time I'm having contact again is if they come in because they were hurt again and they need another exam, or there are some test results that we need to contact them about for further healthcare treatment. But in terms of their path to healing, I believe introducing an advocate to your patient, whether that patient wants to spend 1 minute with an advocate or wants that advocate to stay for the entire exam, that is the most important step at calming that patient down, starting to give them control over their body, and you point them in the direction to their path of healing. An advocate can help them navigate that path. I can't help them navigate that path. That path is going to look different for every single one of my patients, but the path to healing is there. We've just got to get our patients to the beginning of the path. I also believe that advocates are not just a gift to our patients, they are a gift to us. I fully believe that when forensic nursing programs partner with advocacy and provide advocacy for 100% of their patients, not just their sexual assault patients, it helps build resiliency in the nurse. Because you're right, Sarah, we do bond very quickly with our patients. We have a very unique relationship with them. Do my patients want to be in an exam room going through this exam? Of course not. Do they want somebody touching their body and taking samples off them? No, they don't. Pictures? No. Do they want to give a history about what happened to their nurse? No. So we bond very quickly with these patients. When I know I've provided that connection, I know that my patient has support should they choose to use it after discharge. The other thing that I will say about in the exams, and this is me, I've come to learn this, I really believe, as crazy as this sounds, that another gift that I can give my patient, a form of justice, is asking them about the history of their assault. This is a difficult part, relaying the history to a nurse. This is a difficult part of the exam that I think people think that must be the worst part of the exam. And for many patients it is. But what I've come to learn is that when I say to a patient, now we're to the point of the exam where I need to ask you about the event that brought you in here today. I'm not a police officer, so I don't need to know the same things a police officer would. I'm a nurse. What I need to know is, how did things start, exactly what happened to your body, and how did they end? When you give me this information, it's going to help me as a nurse know how to better take care of you and your body. I'm going to know what you're at risk of, what I need to look for, and anything that we need to address. Whenever you're ready, go ahead and let me know what happened to you. What I've done in that 40-second introduction to a history is I've let them know it's okay to tell me what happened to you, and I'm going to do something useful with that. And what I find is it's almost like giving permission for those patients to tell us all of the dirty details, all of the difficult details of what happened. And even though it's difficult for them to talk about, there's a sense of therapeutic communication that happens, because all I'm simply doing is bearing witness to what they endured. And that is a sense of justice, when they are able to say to somebody, this is exactly what happened to me. This is how it made me feel. This is how I feel now. And I'm here. And they end and I say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm really glad you made the decision to come in here today. It's a good thing you're here. I've given them validation for that. To me, that's a sense of justice, whether that goes, that crime goes to the courtroom or not. So justice may be addressing pregnancy, maybe addressing sexually transmitted infection. I will tell you that where I was when I did the bulk of my exams in Colorado Springs, it's a very, the makeup of my community has a lot of military, both Air Force and Army. And so I believe that I had a higher percentage of male patients than some other forensic programs across the country. And for a lot of those male patients, the fear of HIV is what brought them in. And the fear of not being believed is what prevented them from coming in sooner. I also have in Colorado Springs a very high religious community. A lot of people don't realize that it's kind of the religious capital of the world for organizations to have their headquarters, church headquarters there. So some of my patients who were assaulted within the context of their religious community was very difficult for them. So connecting them to advocates who can help with that felt like a sense of justice too, because very similar to military, being assaulted within your family network, meaning your religious network or your military network, brings another layer of healing that needs to occur. All right, so for me, it's therapeutic messages, giving my patient good healthcare and supporting them in their choices, even if I wish they were making different choices. All right, now let's move on to law enforcement. Let's talk about justice. I really think this might be one of the more difficult ones, and I don't believe we have any law enforcement in this group. If I'm wrong, feel free to speak up, although traditionally law enforcement doesn't like unmuting and talking. But how can we define justice in a completely different way for law enforcement officers? Any ideas?
Maybe, sorry, I keep going in and out of eating lunch, so I don't want you to have to see me chomping at the bit. So I see a lot of unfairness when it comes to, first of all, training, the victim-centered approach, and it's to say the least, a headache that they're lacking that. That's an unjust situation, that they don't have that access and that knowledge. On another end, it's also hard to watch our victim survivors almost blame law enforcement for doing something wrong or reporting something wrong or just doing something wrong in their eyes, that they're moving the blame to the officer involved when the officer has such a strict road to follow. So I don't know how to define it, but I know that those are the unjust things that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And as a result of a bad situation where law enforcement didn't do the right thing, we had asked the state foundation and information of rape to help us with training of law enforcement. And to kick it off, the last SART meeting I had in May, I defined that day to be Law Enforcement Day. And I invited everybody in the counties to be there. It would do a roundtable discussion without pointing the finger like, you did this wrong, and don't you know about victims' rights, and this has been passed in this state. So we're doing law enforcement training next Wednesday, and we're hosting it, but we've got special people that are trained in this to give us and them that there are rules to follow, that you have to do that without jeopardizing, traumatizing the victim all over again. Sometimes our law enforcement, the older they are, they don't want to change. It worked for them X amount of years ago, it's going to work that way again. And it's hard to convince them that, no, that's the wrong way, without slapping them a couple of times. And then you get in trouble with that. But that's how it makes me feel. So we're focusing on training.
I love that. That's great. Giving them the tools that they need to be successful in their roles. I agree. Some of the more difficult technical assistance that I've helped communities with around MDTs or SARTs have been when it's perceived by the community and the other SART members that law enforcement needs to change their approach, particularly in approaching victims who are reporting, change their approach in the way that they're getting the details, whether it's for the initial report or the more in-depth interview. And I think Sarah and Danelle, you guys do a good job of trying to look at this from a different perspective. Any of us who need to admit that we need to change the way we're doing things, whether it's me as a nurse or an advocate, law enforcement, or a prosecutor, to admit that we need to change the way we're doing things, we may internally feel sometimes that that means we have to admit that we've been doing wrong and harming those that we're serving. And none of us went into this work to harm people or to do things inappropriately. So that is that self-assessment, that systems assessment. How do we help frame the approach so that we're making sure people understand, we know you're here because you care about your community. I don't have answers for you. I just know that that has been some of our largest obstacles about changing some of the systems that need to be changed. This one, when I was putting this presentation together, this was the hardest slide for me to think about. How would I answer this question if somebody was asking me? And really, probably the most tangible thing that I can come up with is safety. Can a law enforcement officer feel like they have achieved some form of justice for the person, the victim that they're interacting with, if they can help ensure that safety? That was the most tangible one for me. Anyone else have any other ideas for law enforcement and justice?
I agree with you, Kim, that the law enforcement side, they really think of, they don't want the perpetrator to repeat the offense. Yeah. So they think of protecting the rest of the community. So they think of punishment. They don't think of victim-centered services. And that's totally understandable. And I love working with law enforcement, even though they're different. I think we make a really good team, advocates plus law enforcement, and especially if you have, relationships that are based on trust and respect, and it's really, then you get the best team.
Yeah, I'm going to share a story. When I was a newer SANE, there was a particularly violent stranger assault on a patient, and she had multiple perpetrators, and law enforcement was quite concerned this was going to happen to somebody else in our community. And several days had gone by and they still didn't have suspects. And then they got a lead, and they got this group of men who they thought had committed this crime, but none of them would confess, and they weren't getting anywhere. So law enforcement, this was prior to us having a SART. They asked all the different disciplines involved to come to the table at the Police Operations Center. So because I had done the victim's exam, I was there. Our local advocacy, the confidential one, was represented. And then the prosecutor handling the case, who would eventually be handling the case, was there. But really it was about the law enforcement team coming together and coming up and strategizing. And at the end, there were 4 different detectives who each had a different suspect, and they were trying to decide, should they offer a deal to one of them to try to get him to turn on the others. But this particular victim had ended up in surgery, and she almost died, and she had some pretty severe injuries that she's going to have for the rest of her life. So high emotions at the end. These 2 detectives got in a fight, like chairs overturned, yelling at each other, because one was so passionate that they not offer a plea, saying, but they're all culpable. This is the worst case I've ever seen. They all need to go to jail. And the other one saying, but what if none of them go to jail? Isn't turning one of them better than, and 3 going to jail better than none? And for me to see the passion, to see the desperation for justice, it was almost therapeutic to me, because I had not seen that level of passion. I'd seen the very composed demeanor of law enforcement before. And really that is the case that helped us decide we need to get together. We need to have an MDT, because this collaboration is too valuable. And we're just talking about one case. Imagine if we can have this collaboration with all of our cases in the systems. So to me, yes, Dilworth, it helps to be trauma informed, and maybe justice is not a lot different for the role of law enforcement than that of advocate or healthcare. Is there a way law enforcement can say, I believe you, and this isn't your fault, and start from there? Let's move on to prosecutors. This one's a little difficult too. How can we define justice for prosecutors if we can't use this definition that we have up top. If we're saying we're not going to say getting a guilty verdict is justice, how can a prosecutor define justice? Any ideas? I know the first two, the advocate and the clinician, are much easier than law enforcement and prosecutor. I thought about this too, putting this together. So I'll tell you, training prosecutors is some of what we do. We don't train them. We assist in the healthcare side of the training at IFN, working a lot with Equitas. I'm not sure if you guys know that organization, but I've watched this a lot. And then watching the prosecutors in my community when we're doing pretrial prep and strategizing, how much they really care about this and how devastated they are with not guilty verdicts sometimes. I think part of, good, Magdalena, I'm glad you're having this conversation with your local prosecutor. I think that when you think about how we evaluate prosecutors, it's how many times do they bring cases forward that they can win, and how many times do they bring cases forward and they lose, which that's a terrible way to evaluate prosecutors, because what's going to happen? They're not going to bring very many cases forward. And I know your experience is no different than mine in your community. Prosecutors typically will say sexual assault cases are harder to try than homicide cases. You know, the evidence is harder to prove. He said, she said, or she said, or he said, whatever your gender dynamics are in victim and perpetrator, these are hard things. Plus, juries expect hard evidence, and oftentimes there's not a lot of hard evidence. So what we know from a little bit of research from Rebecca Campbell is that victims who go through the criminal justice system, even when there's a not guilty verdict, they feel a sense of justice because somebody fought for them. So a prosecutor who starts out their interview with a victim saying, I'm not sure I can win this case, but I'm going to try because what happened to you isn't okay. That is therapeutic. That is a justice statement. And even with a not guilty verdict, that victim will remember that statement and remember that somebody fought for me. So prosecutors forget the level of power and authority that they have through the perception of the general community. I think the same is law enforcement too. They sometimes forget just by walking into a room with a badge or a uniform, you have a level of authority. A prosecutor who has the decision, they have the power to decide if they're bringing charges forth and what those charges are going to be and how they're going to try this case, the questions they're going to ask, they have a lot of power. So just fighting, even if it's, I'm going to offer a plea agreement, I'm not sure I can win this case, and I know this guy is guilty, so I'm going to offer this plea agreement because I want to see some form of justice for you. So their words, their approach, and just fighting can be a sense of justice. And I do think we, other disciplines, have a duty and an obligation to remind the prosecutors of this once in a while, because they absorb that trauma just as much and often as we do in other professions. Thank you. Thank you all for giving me the time and the conversation with this so that we can move forward. And lastly, Carolyn, I think it was Carolyn brought it up. How does a survivor define justice? And I think that we can all agree, Carolyn wrapped this up nicely with a nice bow. Justice is different for our victims, and the definition is going to be different based on their experience, who they are, and the outcomes that they would like. So asking what it means to them and helping guide their path to that as much as we can. Also, we need to remember that their voices need to be heard in the SART, and their voices need to be heard. So back to the basics. What is a SART? This multidisciplinary team really is this, what we need to think about is SARTs, we're a group of people who work together for a common goal. And if our common goal is justice, maybe we need to start with the conversation that justice may need to be more broadly and abstractly defined than we have typically defined that in the past. And it's okay to have a different common goal. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about some of the team's steps to create and sustain a victim-centered and trauma-informed response. Successful SART tips. 1, defining specific roles and responsibilities. It is great that we all have a common goal. It's important that we all have a common goal, but those of us within the SART need to recognize and be respectful of the other disciplines who may have different objectives than us. So a common example I'll use is this terrible term that everybody cringes when they hear it, HIPAA. Nobody likes to talk about HIPAA, but healthcare needs to understand that HIPAA applies to healthcare. It doesn't apply to law enforcement. That's often why law enforcement doesn't understand it. Confidentiality, when another common headbutting area is advocates who can't provide confidential information, yet law enforcement needs it or wants it in order to fulfill their role. So these specific roles and responsibilities are important, discussing the parameters in which we can work, reminding one another and being respectful of those parameters. We talked about child protection earlier, another entity that gets blamed for a lot of things. If you don't understand the parameters in which case workers need to work within for child protection, you may think they're not doing their job or doing it well, when in reality they have certain parameters, and maybe what you're doing in your role could help them overcome some of those parameters, but we're not aware of them if we don't know them. Of course, mutual trust in relationships. This comes with time and putting in the work. You're not going to have that trust until you develop the trust. You're not going to have respect until you develop the respect. But what's the end result? Really strong relationships that help not only the SART team, but help also you building your own resiliency. Having a designated coordinator, and this looks different for different communities. What's going to work for you? What's going to work for your SART? This is typically a person who doesn't function necessarily in their discipline, but rather as a neutral party that helps to focus the team's direction. They lead and they facilitate, and this may rotate. It may be that it's a designated or paid position, or it may be a volunteer position that rotates maybe every year or every couple of years. Scheduled consistent meetings that team members make a concerted effort to attend, or send someone who can attend and report back if they're unable to. Formalized commitments, a consistent set of expectations. This may be a formal memorandum of understanding like an MOU, or a discussed and agreed upon set of expectations. Continuing along the same path is these defined characteristics. This is from the from MinCasa. I love their resources that they have for in MinCasa tool and resource page. It's one of the most helpful resources I've ever seen for communities. And one of the reasons I love this resource is because it translates to a lot of different types of communities, whether we're talking urban or rural, and very specific communities like college campuses and others. So shared vision. I wrote a couple of notes down. Shared vision is this framework for decision making, and this really does come back to that victim-centered care. Any of your shared vision should return to what is important, and at core, that victim-centered care. Shared learning, this is seeking out learning opportunities, learning from setbacks, and learning from successes. So shared learning, sometimes we focus on what's not going right, what's wrong, and what do we need to fix. A very effective approach can be, wait, let's stop and talk about what's working well. If we review something that's working well and we compare it to what's not working well, what are the factors in this good point that we can implement in this point that's not working? This is sometimes for SARTs, and they all function differently, but if you're reviewing cases, whether they're current cases or adjudicated cases, if you're picking cases where things all went terribly wrong, sometimes it can feel like you're pointing fingers and blaming people. Try to pick a case that in your perception went really great. Like every entity did what they were supposed to do, and look at this wonderful outcome. And then have the different entities report on their part so that they can really feel validated and celebrated. Continual improvement. Self-assessment is one of the most difficult things. I don't care if you're talking about SART or any other, teacher, or how I am as a parent. Self-assessment is a very difficult thing to do. Again, I'm going to encourage you, when you're doing SART self-assessment, to also look at the positive things. This really focuses around culturally competent care, not just victim-centered care. And this continued improvement really should be circling back to that very first step, which is your shared vision. Diverse membership sounds very simple. It's not actually as easy as it sounds. This can mean the disciplines, having diverse disciplines as a part of your group. But then that self-assessment of, do your disciplines or those extra members that you're inviting once in a while, do they reflect what your community looks like? So if I'm in a community where we have a lot of Native American population, but I look at our SART or our board or our MDT and there's no Native American representation, that's a problem. And we need to fix on how we're going to get our diverse membership of this group to reflect what our community looks like. Multi-level leadership. This is not just leadership within the SART, but it's recognizing that your different disciplines have leadership at their respective organizations. So if you're asking the forensic nurse to change a process, that nurse may not have the authority or the ability to change it without going back and getting leadership approval. And I'm going to come back to this thought in just a minute in some future slides. And then collaboration, of course, strong relationships, sharing perspectives, and providing a safe place for some very challenging conversations that may need to occur. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainability. This sounds like a very boring word. It is a very boring word, but it's a crucial thing for us to think about. There will be times that challenges arise and threaten the stability of the SART. These may be challenges that one entity experiences. So if you're a SART and the hospital pulls funding for your SANE program and all of a sudden you're without SANEs, that is not just a threat on the healthcare for your community, but it's a threat to the sustainability and the functioning of your SART. Same thing with advocacy. Same thing if there's a leadership turnover in law enforcement and they're not given the approval or the time or the resources to attend SARTs. And same thing with prosecutors. Prosecutors can have a new elected DA or a turnover. There can be expectations that they're not bringing these cases forward even when they want to, or they're given parameters within their office that make it more difficult to bring cases forward that they want to. So I am going to talk from the perspective of the SANE Sustainability Project. So what is this? This is a project that happened probably 10 years ago, where SANE programs that were failing or had closed could apply for an assessment. And a team went to 10 different sites and did a very in-depth assessment of policies, procedures, nurses' education, leadership, the community support, lack of support, the SART or lack of SART. Now, I want you to put your lens or your perspective on this. And so I'm talking about SANE programs, but the findings absolutely translate into other disciplines. The findings were really fascinating to me. So what is sustainability? First of all, creating an organizational strategy and infrastructure to ensure collaborative responses to sexual violence remain viable, that you continue to function the way that you're supposed to in the most effective way. Sustainability focuses on the ability of a sane program to survive things that are like staff transitions, social, political, and economic challenges, the impact of emerging issues, and scientific or medical breakthroughs that can affect team caseloads and resources. A good example of something that affects this is the rape kit backlogs, or changes to national protocols or standards, or statewide legislation that's passed, whether it's good or bad, elections, so that your local leadership and authority may change and impact what's happening. So sustainability planning is a process that requires continued dialogue, whether we're talking about programs or SARTs, setting short and long-term goals, flexibility, creativity, and motivation. What is trauma-informed service delivery? Again, I'm talking about SANE programs, but it's creating victim-centered settings, maintaining involvement with victims beyond the initial intervention, and managing and reducing vicarious trauma. You can tell I'm going faster because I'm getting to the meat of things. Why do we need help with sustainability? Well, sexual assault nurse examiner programs are often run by people with great passion for the work, which is our strength. And especially in rural communities, you will see that you may have one, we call them nurse champion, one nurse champion who's trying to do all of this work on his or her own. They may have one or two other nurses, they may have only themselves. This is a very dangerous situation in terms of the viability of a SANE program. One nurse cannot be available 24/7. One advocate cannot be available 24/7. One law enforcement officer cannot be available 24/7, and nor can one prosecutor. It is impossible for us to be in our job 24/7. It's not healthy and it's not sustainable. Like we said before, unfortunately, nursing education doesn't include any business coursework, and few nurses have experience with administrative duties such as budgeting and scheduling. If we nurses could get our poop together, we could run this world. There are so many nurses, but we don't have a business background. We don't have collaboration background. What we have is a heart for our patients and communities. But nobody taught us how to manage a program with business plans and budgets. So that is a problem. Why do we need help with sustainability? Because oftentimes initially there's a lot of support for a SANE program, but then it tapers off. Once a hospital sees how expensive it is to maintain a SANE program, we may see a lot of support in the beginning, and then that funding gets pulled. And then that's not okay. We need to educate leadership that SANE nursing isn't this cute little hobby that some nurses do. This is a true nursing specialty like any other specialty, whether we're talking flight nursing or we're talking lactation consultants or wound care nurses. Dealing with the impact of violence is not a hobby, it's a specialty. So this finding 10 different programs, these teams who go in, do this in-depth dive into what's going on. There were 3 themes that came out of the sustainability project: finances, that may sound familiar to you in your program; collaboration within their system and outside their system; and then recruitment and retention. How do we get other people to do this work and keep them? So here are the strategies and lessons learned from the SANE sustainability project. One common thread seen in site visits was that the SANE was seen as an evidence collector and not as a clinician. So really at the heart of what we do, healthcare. We are there to provide healthcare for our patients. Oh, by the way, as a courtesy to law enforcement and the patient, will collect evidence off your body, but that is not the most important thing we do. The most important thing we do is address the short and long-term health consequences of violence. We need the nurses doing this work to be able to articulate this. Patients should be receiving a higher standard of care from SANE programs, not just a higher standard of evidence collection. This means we have to educate triage to specific healthcare interventions and targeted discharge planning for each individual patient, which you can't have one set of discharge instructions that work for all of the patients. And don't forget the SANE again, when they just, the leadership sees us as evidence collectors, they're more likely to pull funding. And there are still SANEs out there that see themselves as an extension of law enforcement, and they're just there to collect evidence. Fortunately, this is very, it's not very common, and it's becoming a more rare occurrence, which is a good thing. But if you happen to be in a community that is like that, you can reach out to me at IFN, and we will attempt to give you some strategies to address that. If you also happen to be in an area where your healthcare is not allowing advocates into the room during the sexual assault exam, please also reach out to me. We have a lovely position statement from the International Association of Forensic Nurses saying all victims of violence deserve an advocate response. And for programs who still give us ridiculous reasons why the advocate can't be in the room, we can help debunk those reasons. Like I said, the program is not a hobby. This is a true specialty. Funding should be given to the same programs, just like it's given to other programs. If you happen to have SANEs who are not hospital-based and they're community-based, they really need to have liability insurance. So if you're in the model where the nurses are consulting like out of an advocacy program, you need to ensure that they have liability. They could be putting themselves and their license in jeopardy. Again, before 24/7 coverage is not a mandate. This may not be achievable in your community. It's absolutely a goal to work towards, but you don't want to burn the 1 or 2 nurses out who are there doing this work by expecting them to be available 24/7. Consistent quality coverage of some shifts is better than no nurses doing this work. When coverage is inconsistent and undependable, patients end up waiting, which we don't want. And SART members can help by supporting quality over quantity when making these tough decisions. So recruit with specificity, move away from the any nurse will do, any warm body will do. Just like in your profession, you know that there are people who can and should be doing this work, and then there are certain people who are just not cut out for it. We don't want just any nurse. We want a nurse who wants to do this work and understands the importance of why. Define those expectations at the time of hiring, how many shifts, the expectations for response time when you're an on-call program, and the program managers should be modeling some of the expected behaviors, not just sitting behind a desk. Look at the nexus between leadership and retention. The dissatisfied SANEs in the programs that were failing were when these managers weren't modeling what they were asking the scheduled nurses to do. Lack of communication and staff report receiving minimal feedback or guidance on their work were all recipes for disaster. Invest in people, not things. When you have money to spend, we encourage you to spend it on the people, meaning education versus a big fancy piece of equipment. You can have the most expensive colposcope or the fanciest camera in the world, but if the person using that equipment is not trauma informed, your patients are not getting what they so desperately need and deserve. Articulate who you are as a SANE or an advocate or a law enforcement officer and why you do what you do and the value of what you do. Let go of I don't do it, no one will, because again, those nurses who are alone or have a very small team, they will burn out and leave the work if they aren't supported with other people doing the work. Always, this is for all of us. Start looking for a replacement. You can plan to be in your job and for the next 20 years, but you never know what opportunities are going to come your way or the growth or expansion of your program. This is not just for nurses. This is for everyone. Look for somebody that you can mentor for long-term process. In the meantime, you're just creating another great team member. But if there's another opportunity for you, you know you're not leaving your team without strong leadership. Nurture and celebrate your staff. Don't just look at the things that need improvement, but find very purposeful ways to celebrate what everyone is doing. Collaboration, that's not just happy talk. I always think of that song, Stop and Collaborate. I won't sing to you because my singing skills are as good as my math skills. So SANE programs cannot operate in a vacuum or a silo. Collaboration within their institution is really important, and collaboration outside of their institution is really important too. Those teams that are The teams that are nurse run, meaning registered nurses, not nurse practitioners, they should have a medical director and not somebody who just blindly signs off on policies and procedures, but somebody who's really there for them to go to for support. We train nurses to do this work with a very mindful eye on our scope of practice. There is a lot that we can do for our patients within the scope of a registered nurse, but sometimes their injuries or mental health needs go beyond our scope of practice. So it's crucial that we have a medical director who can help support us in those times. So what really impacted the quality of these SANE programs, the findings that a healthcare focused response made you more successful, collaboration made you more successful, a clear understanding of your role and the ability to articulate that role made you more successful, a program that wasn't dependent on just one nurse, and a champion within the parent organization, meaning your leadership that appreciates and understands your work and helps you fight for the budgeting that you deserve. Again, consistency of availability, regular education, adherence to guidelines and policies and procedures, and strong leadership and mentoring of new staff. And I do think that probably translates to your organizations as well. Just a quick situation, one of the most common technical assistant things that we help with SART teams is what happens when maybe a rural sexual assault team has a staff of 6 nurses, 3 of them quit, leaving a staff of 3. What are the options for emergency staffing for the program, and what are the responsibilities of that program to the SART? The discussion is, this is going to depend on what your resources are in your community. But with probably 3 nurses who all have other full-time jobs, 24/7 coverage is not going to be a viable option. So you're going to have to communicate that to the SART team, because if they don't understand what you're going through and they bring a patient to the hospital and you're not there to serve that patient, it's going to jeopardize that trust and that relationship building within the SART. So that is a crucial thing that you need to do during emergency staffing times, is to communicate with the SART. So staffing. What are some options? We can schedule available nurses for shifts. So if a patient comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning, but there's not a nurse until 8, we can either bed that patient in a hospital bed or let them go home and come back at 8 o'clock with those uncovered shifts. You can have that patient travel to the next available SANE program, even if that program is far away. And you can have an emergency room doctor or nurse do that exam. What I think is best is to have these questions answered. When is the next available nurse on? Where's the next available program? And do we have an emergency department or urgent care who can do this? And you present those options to the patient, and the patient gets to decide what they do or don't want to do. This is where it's crucial for an advocate to be helping basically give informed consent, or a medical term, but here's an option, here's the pros and cons to this option, here's your next option, pros and cons, here's your next option, pros and cons. This is unfortunate, we don't have the best option for you, but what's going to work best for you right now, and let's make that happen. Also, can the next available SANE, so if you don't have an available SANE for another 12 hours, can that SANE get on the phone and at least give some reassurance to the patient, explain what's going to happen, encourage them to come back? And can the advocate accompany the patient regardless of where they're going or their choices? And on the back end, can hospital leadership approve incentive for new hires? And can we reward those 3 nurses who stayed to help cover probably more additional shifts?
And Kim, we do have a question here. What's the best way to incentivize training attendance for nurses? We are starting SARTs in rural areas where there are no SANEs. We would like to at least train them on trauma-informed care.
I would say, if you can connect with hospital leadership and get the hospital to let them clock in and pay during the, that, even if it's an offsite training, can you pay them for their time? If there's a way to educate them on how this will help them in their practice, better interact with patients, have better outcomes. I will tell you, not every nurse is going to buy into that because they don't understand the importance of it. And then who do the nurses look up to and respect? Is there a champion within that? Do they have like a beloved director of nursing or charge nurse that you can say, we know that nurses really look up to you. Can you internally help them understand the importance of coming? I would also say to offer it multiple times. Nurses have shifts. If you can get like the day shift to go back and talk to the night shift, this was really valuable. And can you go to them? Is it possible that you can go? Even small education at change of shift, where you've got a captive audience, you go to the emergency department, the night nurses are going home, the day nurses are coming on shift, and they give you a few minutes to talk about the importance of coming to this training. Very similar to when we talk to law enforcement at roll call. They call it roll call. Let them know how welcome they are and why it's important to come to the training. Hopefully that answered the question. If you're looking for a free training for doctors and nurses who work, whether it's clinic, urgent care, emergency room, and they're going to have to do exams because they don't have SANEs, we have a new free training. It's 2 hours online. It gives them the down and the dirty. It's called No SANE in Sight. And it's here is concentrated, victim-centered, patient-centered care and the fundamentals of what you need to know. Not only is it free, it comes with nursing and medical continuing education. And if you have a hospital that says this is a training all doctors and nurses need, we will give you the SCORM, which is what they download into their hospital learning management system, so that that can go hospital-wide through their electronic learning system. Please reach out to me if you're interested in that. It's a fantastic new training, which means it has all of the most updated research and citations. It is a fantastic resource, so please reach out to me. And assure your SART team when you have emergency staffing that 24/7 coverage, getting back to that is your ultimate goal. So please, as teams, allow for quality assurance, reviewing what's happening within your SART and leaving room for improvement, understanding the need for continuing education and training, and celebrating successes. So in the last few minutes, I want to come back to this term, success. To me, it's not a lot different than how we have formally defined justice. So thinking back to all the time we spent, how do you, an alternate definition of justice for advocates, healthcare, law enforcement, and prosecutors, how would you alternately define success? If I say it can't be putting the bad guy in jail, can't be success. I want you to remember the definitions and the discussion that we had. Is it the number of clients or people or survivors or patients that we serve? Is it adherence to our patient policies? For nurses, is it the number of patients who receive care, STI care, pregnancy prevention care? Is it the number of patients that we connect to advocacy? In your role, how can you better define success so that you remain healthy and you remain where you're feeling successful in the vast majority of interactions you're having with patients, victims, or clients or survivors? I also want us to think about how we can better define success within our SARTs. If I say it can't always be putting the bad guy in jail, how else can we define justice? How else can we define success? And are we having those conversations so that we're changing the culture? And yes, Nelson, I agree with you. Absolutely. Strengthening community collaboration and gaining commitment from community leaders would be a beautiful definition of success. And lastly, value relationships. Remember within your own institutions, your own organizations, and then within your own SART, and then with your own community, there's different layers of this. Collaboration allows for change. Collaboration allows for solving difficult problems. Yes, we all know tensions can get high, but there isn't a group that better understands the lows of this work or the absolute highs. We talk about vicarious trauma a lot, but do we talk enough about resiliency? And these strong relationships absolutely help us grow resiliency. Resiliency as individuals, resiliency within our own institutions, and resiliency within the SART, which what does that mean? That means we're building resiliency within the communities that we live in and that we serve. And ending in my last 2 minutes, a very quick review of the resources that are out there. I utilized all of these resources to build this presentation, as well as they're the ones that I'm referring people to the most. SAFE-TA stands for Sexual Assault Forensic Examiner Technical Assistant, same thing with kids. This is forensic nurses know this resource, but this resource is available for free for all disciplines. One that might be very interesting to you is the protocol tab and the library tab. That click down library tab has some documents for SARTs. These are the 3 protocols that really guide our medical forensic exams: the adult adolescent protocol, the pediatric protocol, and the national best practice for sexual assault kits. All 3 of them discuss multidisciplinary roles. Like I said before, one of my favorite, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, has an amazing SART tool and resource page. I aesthetically like their website because I think it's one of the easiest sites to navigate and find what you need quickly. We can't all say that. The OVC, Office for Victims of Crime SART Toolkit, the Office for Victims of Crime's SANE Program Development and Operation Guide may be useful to you even when you're not within healthcare. There is a section on multidisciplinary response. And of course, NSVRC's, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, has an updated SART toolkit. I think it was updated in 2018. But the best resources are the survivors in your community, your SART team, and you. Don't forget the value of you, the importance of what you do, and please don't ever forget that what you do daily matters. You'll get a copy of this presentation. All of the resources that I used are listed there in APA format, as is IAFN's technical assistance phone line and general email line, and my personal email as well. So thank you all for your input. That made it much more fun, much more collaborative, and you gave me some really great ideas and things that I wrote down, so thank you. Rachel, anything else you want to say?
Yes, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Kim, for all of this incredible information, for presenting and being here with us today. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did. So thank you for taking the time for this amazing presentation. And I did just drop the survey, so we do encourage you to take that. Let us know how today was for you and give us some feedback. We really, really value that. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And we will see you next week on, I believe it's June 15th, Tuesday, June 15th. So thank you so much, Kim, for all of this today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, feel free to drop up whenever you would like. And yes, we will be sending this presentation out. You will have access to this and as well as the recordings. And have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second session of the National Institute.